All right, we had a question come in online just before the break that asked about undercut banks and ordinary high water mark. And that's a good question. I haven't really addressed it before. So if you're looking at a cross section here and you got a bank that comes out and then it cuts back because of the flow, maybe you're on the outside of a river flow or something, and you've got your ordinary high water hits somewhere back here underneath the ledge of your cut back bank. Well, I would say horizontally, that would be your ordinary high water mark. Pardon me? Sea lion case on the coast.
So you've got land up above, and then you have tidal waters underneath.
Uh-huh.
Who owns it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And if you got a particular case to look at, I would look at it. And we got a good point over here is tide waters and inland waters are often treated differently. But personally, I'm not really familiar with a case where this situation was at issue. You know, if it were my land, upland, I wouldn't want to do anything out here on a ledge because it's too susceptible for falling down. So for the online person, my answer is sorry, but I don't really know the definitive answer to that. Get a shovel. Okay, we got an answer here. Get a shovel, knock it down. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you, but I don't. We had another question kind of backtracking. Where is he? Brian, are you in here? No. Brian was asking me about the surveyor declaring navigability, and is that something surveyors should be comfortable with doing? And my answer is somebody's got to make that call. And a government agency has not always made that call. And in this state, in California, in a lot of states, there's a lot of waterways where the state just hasn't looked at them. They just have not had, in the 150 years or so of statehood, 160 years, have not had occasion to look at every particular waterway and then have the time and resources to do a full navigability study on that. So there will be lots of waterways where that call just hasn't been made. But you have a client who owns property along that waterway, they're expecting somebody to make the call. My advice on that,
doesn't the ORS say that belongs to state lands?
the ORS says that belongs to state lands. Well, what if you call state lands and state land says, we haven't looked at that yet and we're not making a call? What they're going to do is they're going to pull out the federal test and tell you, was it susceptible to commercial traffic at the date of statehood? Not just was it used, but was it susceptible? In its ordinary condition, with minimal difficulty, you know, portaging or something like that, at the time of statehood. And they're going to give you that bullet list. And then they're going to say, you know, but we can't give you a definitive answer right now.
I would say they haven't made a determination, it's non-navigable.
Okay, that's good. I think that that's a reasonable approach. He said that he would say OSL hasn't made a determination, or DSL hasn't made a determination, so therefore I'm defaulting to non-navigable. That's fine. Personally, I would look at the different indications. I would, if I could get the budget for it, which is going to be, if you're in private practice, that's going to be your big, major limitation. What's that?
The big hurdle.
Yeah, that's going to be your big limitation. So if you are so limited and you can't get the information, then yeah, default back to that and say, I believe this is most likely non-navigable. However, if additional information is provided to me at some future date, the answer could change. You know, that's completely factual. You're standing behind what you can decide at the time you're asked to decide it. Question?
Is there any states that have just kind of put a sunset on that, just said if they're not navigable at this point, then they're not going to be? Maybe that's a question for our friends from DSL, but it just seems like this ongoing thing. I mean, it's just
Okay.
a never-ending deal that could change at any minute.
So the question is, on those waterways where there have not been a definitive word on it from DSL, is there a sunset that says, state, you've had plenty of time to act on it, so from here on, we're considering it non-navigable, whatever. Just kind of putting an end to that. At this point, no. And I don't know that the state can, because again, that's a federal test for navigability. And okay, so here's Brian. Brian, we're talking about the surveyor making the call on navigability. And we had one opinion come out of the audience that DSL, if they haven't made an opinion on it, then I'm defaulting to non-navigable, which I believe is your stand on that too. Okay, and I was saying that the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, has given us indicators to look at that are understandable for the common man. So it should be understandable for the common surveyor. I know we're at a slight disadvantage for that, but it's still my opinion that we can look at differences of vegetation, we can look at differences of soil. Sometimes there's some very fine distinctions where we might want to bring in different professionals, a geomorphologist or a plant biologist or something like that. But largely there's going to be a lot of historical research to that. And if you're in private practice, you may or may not. If you're really lucky, you will get the resources to do the research that you need to do. But to do the job fully right, to do a complete navigation study, your research and analysis time is going to dwarf by far all the other portions of your survey, your drafting time, your field time. Where, you know, with an upland boundary, a typical upland boundary, you might only budget 4 hours into it. You know, this looks pretty simple, and I'll get the deeds for everybody around, and I'll take a quick look at them. You know, maybe I'll have to go down a chain of title on one of these. But for a project where you're trying to make a navigability determination, if your client wants you to do that, you're going to have to leave it open, because it could take weeks of man hours to do that research properly. And then on top of that, it could take weeks of analysis to do that research properly. And you may have only, you know, a couple days, 2-3 days of field time in there and cover everything you need to get. So the surveyor making that determination, yes, you can do that if you have the resources to do that, in my opinion. But as in everything else with your survey, that boundary location and even what that boundary is it's still your opinion, subject to review by the courts. But to make another point, I'm going to make this point again in another talk later on. How many licensed surveyors do we have in this room? Quite a few. And let's narrow that down. How many surveyors in this room with more than 30 years of experience? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, reluctant 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. How many filed boundary surveys under your direction that you stamped have you done? Let's start in the back of the room here. Who had, how many? Around 100. Boundary surveys. Rough guess, rough guess. Is it in the hundreds? Is it in the thousands? Okay, say, so we got 200, 1,000, so we've got 1,200. Did we have anybody over here? Okay, 1,300, 1,400. Yeah, we're auctioning here. 1,500. So let's just say round numbers. We have about 2,000 boundary surveys under the direction of about 20 surveyors with over 30 years here. How many of those went to litigation where you had to go and testify to defend your survey, or where your survey was at issue? One.
I defended one on another surveyor's work.
Okay, but not your work.
That was not my original work, no.
Okay.
I defended it.
Okay, green shirt and back. One. So that's 2 total. 3 total. 4 total. 4 total surveys that had to go to court out of about 20 surveyors with about 2,000 surveys. What's the percentage on that? Not much. Less than 0.5%. So for that other 99 point whatever percent of your clients that never got the advantage, I guess, if you want to look at it that way, of having a court say, yes, here's your boundary. Who makes that call for them? Huh? No, for the other 99 point some that never go to court. Who makes that call? Who's licensed to make that call? Everybody, raise your hand. We are licensed to make that call. And so we should be doing our best to identify the boundaries. First, recognize what the boundary is, and then where it is. And a lot of surveyors don't understand that both of those are our job, not just where the boundary is in measurements, but recognizing legally what it is. That's our job, because nobody else is going to do it except for that less than 0.5% of people that end up going and fighting their neighbors in court. So yeah, the surveyor can make that call, but always bearing in mind that whatever decisions you make, whatever you identify, is subject to review by the courts. And so, of course, going along with that is whether you think it's going to court or not, be prepared to go into court and explain what you did and why you did it. Amen.
Well, doesn't it say in the BLM manual that we are here to protect the bona fide rights of the property owner? It says it in the BLM. I was preached that for years before I became a surveyor.
Yeah, and that's specific to the federal surveyors. However, all the states, to my knowledge, all the states, including Oregon, have a provision that, why are we licensed? We are licensed to protect the public. Yes. So it's the same thing. Brian.
Just to clarify, since you called on me about it a moment ago, why I would agree that non-navigability.
Hold that thought.
Oh, do I need a microphone?
Yeah.
The people online can hear. It's just for the people online.
Oh, there's online? Okay, wasn't even aware of that.
Yeah, you got a much bigger
It'd be
audience
nice
than you
if
thought.
My voice would get rid of the gravel here and cooperate. But anyway, since you called on me about it earlier, just to explain why I would agree, as I indicated, that non-navigability should be the default, or at least that's the way I would express it. Well, first of all, I cannot point to a single court case in which a navigability determination made by a surveyor, just a surveyor with no supporting professionals from other disciplines, has been upheld, ever, anywhere. The cases where I have seen a navigability decision, either for navigability or for non-navigability, upheld, were cases in which the surveyor had consummate professionals supporting him, a geomorphologist, a wildlife biologist. In other words, the evidence was overwhelming. I've never seen a decision made solely by a surveyor upheld by a court. If you can point to one, that's fantastic. You will educate me in that.
Well, that's a good point, Brian. And I have not seen any that looked to and said, well, just the surveyor did this and he was unqualified, so we're throwing that out. What I have seen is based upon lots of historical evidence and quite often those supporting professions. And I don't know if you were in a room when I mentioned that earlier, but I talked about some places where the indicators are very nuanced, where it's difficult to tell where the soil changes. It's difficult to tell where you're going from more aquatic to more upland type vegetation. And that's where you want to bring in those other professionals and get that. Sometimes it's so clear cut that there's no need for that. But if you've got a lot of historical evidence, then I think you can make that call. That's my opinion. And again, if we went around a room, you know, we've got about 60 people in here, so we'll come up with about 70 different opinions. That's just the nature of our profession. So, you know, take it for what it's worth. My opinion, yeah, you can make the call relying on the right information, right historical research, and in many cases, the right corroborating opinions from other professions to support. You know, as far as waiting on the state to make the call, I think that's the safe bet. I think in a lot of cases, particularly because of budgetary constraints, that's probably your best bet. However, if you do have the resources to do it, and you get all this information and everything's pointing to navigable, but the DSL hasn't made a call, I think it's the wrong decision because you have the information to say otherwise, and DSL's reason is, we just haven't looked at that waterway yet. We haven't done a navigability study. We don't have the resources allocated to do that anytime in the near future, and so we're not going to make a call. Here's your test. Here's your test. Go apply it as you will or won't. And that's the nature of a bureaucracy, is you know, no individual person in that bureaucracy is going to be able to make that decision. Yes, we're going to go out and we're going to spend $500,000 to figure out if this river, out in kind of the middle of nowhere, is navigable, where we're going to have, in the next 50 years, maybe 2 landowners who have a concern over it. Yes?
Historically, it's never been in the property owner's best interest to say it's navigable. The property owner always wants to own the center of stream so they can mine the gravel out of it. It's always the state that comes in afterwards and files a suit, and they take it to court to determine whether that section of the river was navigable or not.
Well, and that's, yep, you're right. It's in the client's best interest if they want to get in there and start mining the gravel and sand out of there. However, it's also possibly inviting that lawsuit, which could take up all their profits plus some for that mining. So is that in their best interest? Making a call that may or probably will invite a very expensive lawsuit. That's something where, you know, I would, on my map and in talking to my client, I would tell them, you know, here's my limitations, which is usually going to be in terms of, unless you want to pay for more, this is the decision I would make right now. However, you know, it may be this way or it may be that way. Take it for what it's worth. You make the call, client. In other words, inform your client of where you are with the information you have, and let them make the call. I personally, I don't go into a waterway and, you know, start surveying a water boundary with an assumption that, you know, this is navigable, now I got to prove it non-navigable, or vice versa. I don't go in with that assumption. I go in and I say, I have no idea. I'm going to get as much information as I can and make the decision from whatever information I have. I'll make the decision if I'm able to get enough information. A lot of times your client, you know, they're thinking $2,000 for a survey. You're going to give them sticker shock by telling them $8,000. And then you say, oh, but you got a water boundary? Could be $250,000. I mean, they're going to be a sticker shock. And because they don't understand how much research and how much analysis is going to be going into it if they want you to make that call. So a lot of times you're just not going to be able to make that call, and you're maybe draw the higher water line, draw the middle on there, and explain where you're at with the information you have, and advise your client accordingly. They have a list, and but I would understand it's not considered all-inclusive. Is every waterway in Oregon that's considered navigable for tidal purposes necessarily on that list? Is it a definitive list?
Tidal waters,
Title.
TIDAL, are just generally listed as anything that is tidal would be navigable. But then the rivers are specifically listed, the ones that we have declared as navigable are specifically listed, and lakes, I mean, we say meandered lakes, we do have a list of lakes as well. So it's about as complete as we can get. And it's more like if somebody went to they wanted to do the gravel mining, or they wanted to put a dock or do a lease or something else, those are definitely the ones that you would say they would need an authorization. Well, not necessarily an authorization, but those are the ones that we claim. But you could always call and talk to somebody to get more specifics.
I should leave a microphone with you.
We do have
So-
a list.
So they do have a list. But would you say that every waterway that's navigable for tidal purposes is on that list?
Except the TIDAL.
No, Title. Don't change the question.
So that's what I'm saying is the ones that are not specifically listed are the ones that are tidally influenced, TIDALLY, are not individually listed on the list. If you're talking about above the tide, then yes, they are individually listed.
They're individually listed. Is that a complete list at this time? So you keep hedging. I ask you if it's a complete list, and you give me a hedge, so that negates that.
It's at this time, and we do, the 95, there were laws in 95 that went into place that made it so that we're a bit hand-tied.
So there are
So
laws that
our
went into
list that
effect
we
in
have on our
95.
website is complete as of this date. We may do additional studies in the future and add additional waterways. But we're not able to say on those waterways where a court or DSL has not made a determination, we are not able to say one way or another whether it's navigable.
Okay, so your answer is it's a fairly complete list, but no, there may be waterways out there that just haven't been looked at.
Yeah, it's kind of like ODOT's presentation yesterday. It's a living list. I mean, if there's a court case that comes along, it might knock some of the lakes off of there. Who knows? So it's kind of a living list. It's the best that we have.
Okay, so it's relatively reliable, but it could change. That's about as good as the state can get, and unless they get the resources to go and hit every waterway in the state at some point, which they haven't so far and are not likely to. It's a list subject to change, but it's relatively reliable.
Just a real quick additional comment.
I think I might have turned that off.
Somebody turned it on? How do you turn it on?
Good question.
It's on, it's on? Yeah, it sounds like it's on. Would DSL agree that any DSL determination of navigability is subject to judicial review?
But there are limits. My understanding is that there's limits. Once we make a determination, there's a certain amount of time somebody can say, I don't agree with that, and contest it in court.
A statute of limitations, essentially.
I believe there is, but that's not to say that sometimes somebody could take it to a federal court and say, what we decided at the state level doesn't meet the federal test, and
Very good point, because obviously the Oregon statutes would not prevent an action in federal court.
Correct.
Very, very good point.
Yeah, so for those people watching the video, the DSL determinations are subject to court review, and even if they go to the state courts, they're still subject to potential federal court review.
Could you confirm that she said earlier that anything above the tidal influence, right, tidally, that those rivers are on a list right now, which is subject to change, but you're pretty sure that you're confident? All right.
Okay. Okay, so I think that gets us caught up from stuff before the break. Moving on to meanders. Just some basic stuff here that most of you, I'm sure, are aware of. Regular meander corners are along the section lines at or near the high water mark on navigable, or what the deputy surveyor on the site at the time that survey was made thought was probably navigable. Special meander corners are along aliquot divisions on a lake that is within a section. Auxiliary, if you've got something within the least division, and what's the least division that they would patent out? I don't know. In some places it was 40, some places it was 160. But auxiliary meander corner, tied off from the nearest regular section corner, quarter corner. So what do meanders represent? If you ask most engineers, they think that those are property lines. If you ask a lot of surveyors up where I'm working now, they think they're set in stone property lines. They're not. They're a traverse that is supposed to approximate the ordinary high water mark so that they could determine acreages for sale and show approximately the sinuosities of the shorelines. So the ordinary high water mark, or line of mean high tide, per the feds, is the actual boundary where there's a meander line, not the meander line itself. So here, this is also along the San Joaquin River down south. Along this side of the river, I think this was in 1864, 1868, something like that, they went along the bank. So those meander lines represent the bank of the river pretty well. On this side, on the other side, right side, they did something else. This was in the early 1850s. And they went along the edge of the S&O lines. That is not truly a meander line. It was called such as they did the survey, but it wasn't, because they meandered something other than the water boundary.
You might want to just clarify S&O,
Swamp and overflow. Yeah, we're going to get into swamp and overflow a little bit more. We talked about it a little bit earlier. So for those that didn't hear, he just said, clarify about S&Os, swamp and overflow. Such riparian boundaries are ambulatory, not fixed. So that meander line gives you the approximate position when that survey was performed. But the boundary line is wherever the ordinary high water mark is now, as long as it's been naturally moving. So question of navigability for tidal and its interpretation of the federal courts. It's a matter of federal law, not a matter of state law. We talked about that briefly earlier. So it's a federal test. Courts have ruled that non-federal surveys depicting a boundary adjacent to water are meander lines. Now a lot of states don't have this in the courts yet. They haven't definitively answered it one way or the other, but there are a couple of good cases out of California that just make sense to me. In this case, Lechuza Villas was an upland subdivision that showed this line down at the coast that said high water as of such and such a date. And the The court says ambulatory rather than fixed, and that it was the only reasonable interpretation of such lines. So in California anyway, the idea of who can run meander lines is not limited to the federal surveyor. I've read a couple of things where, was it the latest version of Clark on Boundaries, so Robillard on Boundaries, in the 2008 supplement, he's got a couple of paragraphs where he says, oh no, it's just definitely only federal surveyors. Nobody else can run meander lines. And I read that and I thought, well, that's ridiculous. With the state, I did that. In private sector, I've done that. How many people here, non-federal surveyors, have depicted a water boundary with their own meanders? I mean, their own set of courses. Plenty. So almost half this audience has. And did you draw those intending to create a fixed boundary there? And I'm seeing a lot of no's. One thing you'll notice in that supplement and the 2 or 3 paragraphs Walt Robillard has is it's one of the things that you'll find in the later versions of his writings that has no legal backup for the opinion. So that's Walt's opinion. And I respect his opinion. He's done a lot of great stuff for the profession. You know, going around and teaching like this, updating the books he's updated. But I will say in the later versions, you have to kind of look and say, okay, is this Walt's opinion or is he giving me some good legal backup for this? And that's one where he's not. So meanders, unless falling within one of few exceptions, meanders approximate the statutory ambulatory boundary. So they were intended to approximate the ordinary high water, but if the statutory boundary is low water, well, then it's the low water. It's not the meander line. So what do they represent in Oregon? It could be the best or only evidence of the location of the lakeshore on or before May 25th, 1921. Could be. And in which case the state claims everything waterward of the meander lines or the ordinary high water mark on that. But lacking other evidence of where that ordinary high water mark is, what does the state use? The meander line. Okay, and again, in my opinion, if those lands originated from a state patent, this would be fully applicable. If they originated in federal patent, I don't believe it would. I have not found a case where that's been tested, but I don't think that a state statute can come and limit a federal patent made before that. Title to submersible and submerged lands of meandered lakes not included in the grant or conveyance from the state of Oregon is vested in the state of Oregon. So there you go. Patented from the state. And nothing in this title impairs that title and land added prior to the date of that statute by natural accretion or reliction. But how do you determine what accretion happened before then or after that? Again, I think it's going to go back to depending upon where the title came from and the date of the original title. Riparian owners along lawfully drained lakes are those who can show natural accretion or reliction prior to 1921, gain title to the least nominal aliquot part. Again, likewise to the previous statutes we were just talking about, I think that's going to depend on whether it's state title or state patent or federal patent. Was the patent before or after May of 1921. And no person shall acquire title by reliction, accretion, or otherwise past the least fractional subdivision. And again, same stuff. Evidence of meander lines along a stream are evidence of navigability, a potential basis. They're not proof. They're just one part of the body of evidence. You may be surveying along a meandered stream or on a meandered lake, and it might not pass that federal test. Again, you know, if you don't have the resources to go back and revisit that question, your safest bet is to just go back to the DSL list and put the appropriate limitations in your narrative. And, you know, there's statutorily, the state makes a claim for all meandered lakes. That's still subject to a federal test. Meander line will be considered the boundary on navigable lakes if no superior evidence of the location of the shore on or before the May 25th, 1921 exists. So sometimes that's going to be, probably most of the times, that's going to be pretty hard to find that superior evidence. Moving on to islands. An island existing at the time of statehood was part of the federal domain lands. If the feds did not survey it at that time, then it was just omitted lands, and at this time it would be unpatented land, so the feds would still own it. So it's unsurveyed lands of the public domain. That's a case that originated out of Idaho, went to the U.S. Supreme Court. U.S. v. Hutchings. I don't remember where that one came out of. Brian, are you aware of that one?
I'm thinking Oklahoma.
Oklahoma?
It's definitely not Oregon, Washington.
Okay. Another state, but same principle. It's applicable across the U.S. Certain exceptions may apply on non-navigable waters. There was this case in Michigan, non-navigable lake with an island on it, and all the lands around had been patented off, and directly in front of one of those was this island. And so the person who owned that upland patent went out and built a cabin out on the island, decades and decades and decades ago. 1992, or shortly before that, the BLM comes along and they don't declare the lake to be navigable, but they say, no, you don't own that island. This is our cabin, our island now. And so it went to court, and the U.S. court, in this case, appeals court, said that the government chose not to survey the island of a non-navigable lake, considered the comparative area of the riparian parcel to the island. So they looked at it and said, yep, that was, what was patented was on the shore. It's a big parcel of land. You got a little island out here. And that the riparian owner cannot be divested of the right of their ownership by a later survey. Now, let's look at the underlying causes of this. If you have a non-navigable lake and you patented off a piece of lakefront, where does their actual fee go to? The center of the lake. So, depending on how that is, if it's a long lake, it might be, a center line that you go out perpendicular to. If it's a round lake, you might have a pie-shaped wedge. However this lake was, that island was within that area that would be considered part of that upland. They owned that bed because it's non-navigable. They owned it to the middle of the lake, and so an island popping up out of that bed that they owned, well, they own that too, because it's non-navigable. So, too bad, government. Court ruled that if the government chose not to survey an island due to its perceived lack of value, the owner of the riparian parcel cannot be divested of the title due to the government's later reconsideration of that island's value. So it's like, yeah, well, you can have that, it's not worth anything. No, I changed my mind. That's worth something now, I want it back. Too bad. Lakes and streams. Submersible lands, except as provided ORS 274705, lands by artificial fill, means lands lying between the line of ordinary high water and the line of ordinary low water of all navigable waters, and all islands. Okay, so it's navigable. So again, who owns the bed? The island coming up out of that bed, it's all surrounded by the bed. If it hasn't been already patented off, previously, then the state owns that, unless it existed before the time of statehood. Islands formed from the bed of navigable river by accretion or reliction after the date of statehood, it belongs to the state. If it is formed by gradual deposits in midstream, it is equally well settled under common law that the island belongs to the owner of the riverbed in the place where the island arose. And so that's the same principle as that lake case we were just talking about. And this is Port of Portland versus an island in the Columbia River. I think this was just north of the airport a little bit, if I recall correctly. But that is, I really like how they worded it, nice and succinct. Who owns the bed? Where did the island come from? Well, there you go. Oh, come on. So, yeah, the underlying principle in the Port of Portland versus island is equal applicable in non-navigable streams. The island formed in the bed of a non-navigable stream by accretion or reliction belongs to upland owners. And we'll get into how you determine which upland owner in a little bit. An island formed to one side, well, right now, one side of the main channel of a non-navigable stream belongs to the upland owner on the same side as that main channel. If it's formed in the center and you've got roughly equal channels on each side, then the island is split, half going to the owner on one side, half going to the owner on the other. So here we're looking at a navigable river, Smith on one side, Jones on the other. The island is before the date of statehood. So unless that island was patented to the predecessor of Smith or predecessor of Jones, the U.S. government still owns that. If that island formed after statehood, it's a navigable river, the state of Oregon owns that. Again, the state of Oregon owned the bed from which the island was formed, so they own the island. Am I losing anybody yet? Everybody awake? Okay, got a question back here. Hold on, time out.
Something would have to tell you it.
This actually came up for me on the Snake River. There's a national wildlife refuge out there, and some of the islands are part of the refuge. And the question was like, how do you know whether they just didn't survey the islands at statehood and patented them out, or were they developed after statehood? Because now we're talking 160-something years. So how do you know whether it formed before or after statehood?
How do you know whether the island formed before or after statehood? That is a great question. There was, and I go back to California, there was an island there in the Klamath River that, same question, was it before or after statehood? And they went out and they did a bunch of surveys. They got arborists involved because there's now trees on the island, so they did cores on trees on various parts of the island. They got soils experts out there to look at it. And so they got, the point that Brian was making about making the call of where the ordinary high water mark is earlier, of getting other experts involved. In that case, the BLM and the State Lands Commission both got these other professions and sciences involved to determine, well, how old are these trees? And looking at the soil, when did these soil deposits most likely occur building up the island? And it came back the state one. They were all happy about that. The trees were younger than date of statehood. But sometimes that's what you do. If you don't have trees there, hope that your soils biologists are good, your soils engineers are good, and can make those determinations for you. Because otherwise, outside of historic mapping, possibly some historic photos if they're available from that far back, I don't know how you would make that call. Brian.
Just an interesting follow-up on that. It is a great question in that you have to do a tremendous amount of research to determine such a thing or to get any kind of convincing evidence. Well, just to repeat, it's a great point to make that it takes a tremendous amount of supporting evidence to prove one way or the other. So what does that mean? That means who has the burden of proof becomes very critical. It's quite likely in any given case, neither side is going to be able to make a convincing argument. So whichever side bears the burden of proof is going to take the hit.
Right, yeah. And I don't really know who, do you know who would have the burden of proof just as a presumption going in?
I can't say for sure. I mean, I think I've seen cases that went both ways on that, where they put the burden of proof on the party trying to prove that it did not exist at that time, or on the other hand, the burden of proof could be on the party trying to prove that it did exist.
Okay, so it's not.
It depends on some of what evidentiary factors are present.
Okay, so there's not like an initial presumption as from what you've seen.
There's not a clear presumption to my knowledge.
Okay, and talking about how things have come out in the various boundary court cases from Brian, I would consider that pretty darn reliable. So there isn't really a presumption going in. So there may be a presumption depending upon who's bringing the case and what the initial evidence brought in is that will kind of shift the burdens around real quickly. Non-navigable streams, we talked about if island forms and it's mostly on one side of the main channel, then it goes with the owner on that side. If you have roughly equal channels, then the island gets split. So water boundaries and descriptions. You may have something expressly called for along the bank, along the shore, along the edge of the Rogue River, something like that. You may have implied calls. Lot 99, the map of Blissful Shores. Where 99, you look at the map, it's a waterfront property. If you have something that calls along the meanders of, with the meander line, generally that's going to be an implied call unless you have a prior conveyance that conveyed the land's waterward of the meander line, between the meander line and the ordinary high water mark. Well, then your meander line will become a fixed upland boundary. That's pretty darn rare. I don't know if I've ever actually seen that in my own practice. I think I've seen maybe an example of that in a book I read somewhere, but otherwise along the meanders of would be generally a call for the statutory boundary. Getting back into shore movement, let's talk about accretion or erosion. Most of the texts you read are going to talk about in terms of time, perceptibility, slow and imperceptible. Well, then that's accretion, that's erosion. And what do they mean by imperceptible or slow? Is generally you can't stand there and watch it change. You can't, walk out your your back door, your front door, and walk up to the shore and notice it's here, and walk up the next day and notice that, oh, now it's over here. Generally speaking. However, I don't think that's the best test. So, but if it's moving according, by a natural accretion or erosion, it's still an ambulatory boundary. It's moving along, wherever that ordinary high water mark physically is, that's your boundary. And then, again, the Oregon exception, which we've talked about several times. Avulsion is typically in the text called sudden and violent. Movement due to avulsion is fixed boundary and last natural location before the avulsion. Islands formed by an avulsive change to the channel fixes the boundary at the old channel. Title to the new island, if you want to call it that, remains with the upland parcel it was formerly a part of. Now, I don't think I've got it in this one, but I think that a better definition of whether or not something was accretion versus avulsion isn't so much a time element. There's some rivers, I did some work along the Colorado River between Arizona and California, quite a bit of work there, where there were movements of the river that would change where it physically is, the main channel, by a quarter mile or more in some places in one season. So over the course of a season, changing a quarter mile, half a mile, that seems pretty fast, pretty perceptible, right? Get some nods. I'm not asking for amens, just a nod or two, okay. There we got some. Oh, we got an amen too, all right. However, that channel just kind of swept across. And as it was eating away over here, it's building up over here. And all the vegetation that was over here, between where the old channel was, the left bank of the old channel, now the right bank of the new channel, it's all gone. It's wiped away. That's accretion, because it's just kind of drifting across. If it jumps from, it was going over here, and now, bam, it's going over here, it just cuts a new channel, that's avulsion. You still have intact upland between the two channels. You still have that upland vegetation there. So that, to me, is a much more definitive and identifiable way of determining between the two. So apportionment of accretions. You've determined you got some accretions. Who owns what now amongst the upland owners? There's no particular method that's prescribed by common law. If you work up in Washington, there's one or two court cases that indicate a presumptive preference toward a prorated type of apportionment. There's a lot of different methods to do it, though, and a lot of them are commonly used. There's no precise procedures, but you can find some if you've got Cole's book, if you've got, I think in the Brown books, they have a short section on it. But generally, the courts prefer whatever method you use, it just needs to be an equitable division. That could be proportionate by a distance, it could be proportionate by area, it could be a right angle from the old line, a lot of different ways. So here, if you just extend them in this particular case, that's not too far off from being equitable, but the way accretions form, a lot of times you'll get a little whoopsie-doodle, that's a technical term, whoopsie-doodle, at the end of the accretions, and if you got a line that goes through there, who gets what? But, so I wouldn't necessarily use that. Here's a proportionate type method where you proportion by, length of the new shoreline over length of the old shoreline, that's pretty equitable. That's a good one to go with. Here's kind of a bisected angles type thing. I think I got this out of Cole. Right angles at the new shoreline. All of these, in this particular case, end up pretty close. Not too far different from each other, so any of them would probably be okay. In a lake, you have roughly a round lake. You may have a meander line. It follows pretty closely part of the lake, part of the way, not so closely in other parts. Well, maybe something was going on there. Maybe this is a really high bank, and it would have been dangerous or just a pain in the butt to actually get down by the shoreline there. So instead they went up with the escarpment. Maybe there's some swamp and overflow lands in there. Who knows? Until you get on the ground, you maybe do some research, you don't know. But, round lake method is what am I doing here? Oh, here you could just extend out the lines. That's one method. You can do a pie thing if it's non-navigable, it goes to the center. If you're just a reliction in this state, the state's going to say, well, that's ours. It's a reliction, that's ours. But again, I think that's going to depend on your patent, where'd your original patent come from, what was the date of that patent. But you could extend those property lines along those radial lines like that. Here's something that's, maybe a little more realistic, maybe, from decades and decades of wave action. You've got some buildup on one side, you've got some erosion on the other side. And what was that there again? Here you got something, a little longer lake. You can extend them. You could do a center line. Well, Evan, how do you determine where the center, if you got a round lake, how do you determine where that center line is, or center point is? Or how do you determine on a longer lake where that line is? My method is, I'll look to see if another surveyor has done it, and I'm just going to repeat his method, because why create problems where they don't need to be created? You're not going to get out there and do something precise. I mean, take 10,000 shots around the edge, do a least squares adjustment, and then linear regression to the middle of the lake. No. Just make a good, reasonable approximation and go with it. If somebody else has already done that, go with theirs. There's a right angle applied to lakes. Bisected angle applied to lakes. Again, whatever's equitable. Here's a prorated. And here's a 1921 method. Going to the next aliquot division line. Now, going back to water boundaries, we've been talking, again, that water boundaries are ambulatory, they move, but very early on, I gave you an indication, no, they don't always move. And remember, we looked at something like this. And so there are certain things that stop it in its tracks. And the reason that star comes up is, in California anyway, they have a heads we win, tails you lose situation, where artificial accretions go to the state, artificial erosions go to the state, and so the upland owner in every case loses. But you're not in California, so I don't think that's necessarily, how do they treat artificial accretions, artificial erosions in this state? Okay, fill placed, that still belongs to the state. What about accretions that occur say because of a jetty that comes out, and you'll have littoral drift that goes along and builds up on, say, the upstream side of the littoral drift and causes a little cutout on the downstream side of that littoral drift.
I think there's court cases that have decided different ways on that one. There's some where the state wasn't involved, where they gave it to the adjacent riparian owners. But if they also, if they developed on a state-owned waterway, let's say that jetty built out and it starts building from that jetty out in the water and then builds toward the land, there's other court cases that have decided that belongs to the state. So we do have some lands, trying to remember if it's by Newport, that might be wrong, but that we got from accretions because a jetty was put in.
Okay, so the courts have gone both ways. And I saw Brian nodding his head here.
In the latter case, I think she's right. I don't disagree with anything she said, but in the latter case, essentially, we're treating it as an island. It's arising from the bed. It's not accretion to the shore.
Aha, okay. So they, in one of the cases Aaron mentioned, the court looked at that accretion as an island that formed. And so in that case, it would be the state owns that. Okay, that makes sense. But otherwise, if it's just accretions building up, it sounds like they're a little bit more mixed on it. So it's possible that could.
Oh, I can tell you, if it was accretion to the shore and the shore was federal land, the United States would.
Okay, so if the shore was federal land, the United States would claim it as part of the upland.
And there is federal court precedent.
Okay, all right. Because, yeah, the feds, when I had been invited to some BLM water training, they indicated that they don't differentiate, really, in most cases, between artificial and natural accretion. So there could be different rules depending on whether or not there's federal land involved. Effect of artificial influence dependent on several factors, federal rules in most states, including Oregon. Okay, so that fits in with what we were just discussing here. So when a meander line followed something other than the bank of a water body, we discussed that before and showed some examples where they followed the edge of a willow thicket or edge of swamp and overflow. That becomes a fixed boundary. Or if they just went the edge of heavy brush because it was, you know, they're getting paid $2 or $3 a mile or whatever, and, you know, we can get half a mile today if we go that way, or we can get 3 miles if we go out here and skirt the edge of it. Easy choice. Grossly inaccurate or fraudulent meander, or when there has been enough accretion between the meander line and the edge of the water body to justify additional federal lots occurring between the time of original survey and a federal patent. So none of the lands have been patented yet, but there's been hundreds of feet of accretion. And so the BLM will go in and resurvey that and divide that accreted land into additional government lots. And then that old meander line becomes fixed. I think I've got a slide showing an example of that a little bit later. All such lands are subject to future survey and sale by the federal government. No longer fixed, where a conveyance expressly accepts the area between the meander line and the actual edge of the waterway. And that's got to be expressly accepts, not just, you know, some surveyor drew a line here and we know that's quite a ways back from the shore, so, you know, that's a fixed boundary and now nobody owns the shore. Or, you know, the subdivider who subdivided the land, sold all the lots, moved Fiji, and was never heard from again. He still owns it, or his heirs own it. You know, BS. Where the area between the meander line and the actual edge of waterway had been previously conveyed. Where there has been a boundary line agreement between the upland owner and the sovereign owner of the bed of a navigable waterway. That was, I assume DSL does that sometimes. In California, there's many occasions where it's disputed where the last natural ordinary high water mark is along an upland parcel. And the state may look at it, the upland owner may look at it, and both parties will go, this is going to be very expensive to litigate. And the value of what the public trust is on or not on for either party it's just the costs of litigation are going to outweigh that. So they'll do a boundary line agreement. They'll come up with the best evidence that they can for where that ordinary high water mark most likely was. They'll draw a line, or it might be the meander lines, it might be just some compromise line, and say, okay, here it is, here it was, it's a fixed boundary now. Avulsion. So we had that case in yesterday's presentation where he had that horseshoe. You know, my wife has always teased me. She said, you couldn't speak if you couldn't draw. I've had a lot of therapy for that, so I'm getting better, but I'm not there yet. And the ordinary high water mark kind of came up something like that, and a new channel cut across kind of here, leaving this old channel over here, something like this. And so when you determine that was an avulsion, and I had a good conversation over, I don't know if it was yesterday or the past few days, something, that it's probably best to assume that when you first come in, assume that it wasn't, assume that it just was accretions formed, and then you have to prove this, have to prove the avulsion, which in a case like what we saw in Sean's yesterday, that seemed like a pretty apparent. I mean, it was pretty apparent there, you know, something had gone on there, and that it was most likely avulsion. But still, go into it, and you got to prove it. But if you do have that avulsion, and you know it's going through, and it's slowly, you know, cutting away over the years, and when one good storm event punches it through, and it didn't sweep across, it didn't wipe all this out, it just essentially created an island there by cutting across here. This may or may not be completely dry. That doesn't really matter. If this is still the main if this has become the main physically navigable channel, and this has just got a trickle going through it, or it's got nothing at all, it's still the same type of thing. If it's a navigable waterway, the state owns this bed. They don't own the new bed, but there is going to be a navigational easement over it, for the public navigational easement. These folks, which in that case I think was the Forest Service, own this, they own this, and they have the fee to that bed. So again, even if state law was a little bit different, there you've got federal lands involved, so you got to look at what the federal law is involved in that. There was something else, another point we were going to make on this. Do you remember that?
Well, I would just add, I think you covered it well.
Okay.
I agree with everything you said, but I would just add that scenario you described, punching through the neck of land, that's exactly what the courts are talking about when they say sudden and violent.
Yeah. There's also, what's up? I was just trying to get the mic over. Oh, okay. Too fast. Essentially, Brian was just said, Evan, you're right, you're always right, nobody should ever question you. So
So I got a question.
oh, now he has a question over here. No, he forgot. Whew. All right. Oh, another point I was going to make along the same lines, but this is slightly different. On a portion of the San Joaquin River I was surveying, where the river made this big horseshoe bend, something like that. And it was originally meandered, you know, more or less along those banks. At some point in the very early 1900s, somebody decided that, let's also make this point, this is Fresno County over here, and this is Madera County on that side. At some point, somebody decided, you know what, just to improve navigation here, because they had passenger boats and freight boats going up and down, and they're saying, this is let's shorten this out. And so they made a cut here. Well, that works exactly like an avulsion. But what happened between then, say about 1915 or so, and 2010, when we surveyed it, 2012, is Fresno County is now claiming this is amongst Fresno County land, and they had a couple of parcels divided here. There was a subdivision down here with lots. And we came along and said, well, no, at the time of statehood, this is the navigable channel, so this land, Fresno, that you're taxing, this belongs to Madera, and you know, Madera, you should be getting these taxes here, and all you people who have houses built here, we own your backyards. We're from the government, and we're here to help. That's they hadn't settled that. It hadn't blown up even by the time I left there, although my stamp is on the survey. I hope they can't find me when it does blow up, which I fully expect it to. So the meander line may be the best or only evidence in that original location in a lot of...
You got me curious on that case. I apologize.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay.
So is the riverbed still there, or did it all get
the old natural
filled in?
riverbed?
Yes, sir.
No, somebody in the meantime has kind of smoothed it out. You can kind of see some depression, well, except for where it goes through these people's backyards.
What?
You can see some depression a little bit at this date, but otherwise it's all kind of just a high deserty looking grass, scrub brush, dirt bike trails all over. I mean, the kids go out there for their BMX bikes because there's subdivisions over here and school right nearby. So state still owns the old riverbed, yes. Because they
Quit
have
claiming.
the obligation to maintain public trust. And without the state's knowledge, because the state's not paying attention to every waterway all the time, somebody made this cut, and then things just progressed for almost about 100 years before the state finally came in and said, oh, here's where the natural riverbed actually was. Now we got a mess we got to clean up.
What prompted that action?
What's that?
What prompted the state to come in and say, oh, the line's here?
The Department of Water Resources was tasked with making the San Joaquin River viable for salmon runs again. There was a court case around 2002 or something like that. Went up to the Supreme Court, and it came back, mandated that the state had to restore the salmon runs in the San Joaquin River and its tributaries. And so part of that was the DWR wanted to reroute a lot of the river, because in places where it goes now, like I told you, 36-inch culvert, where it used to be wider than this room, twice as wide as this room. There's things built up, and there's things that just make the original channel just not viable to carry that much water again. I think DWR looked at it as a very engineering type thing. They wanted to like go north so many thousands of feet or so many miles, and then go east so many thousands of miles or so many miles, and then dump back in. It's like, well, no, if you're gonna have a viable fish stream, you gotta work in all the twists and turns that used to be there. So I don't know what they've done with it or where they're going with it now. I just know that the engineers weren't thinking like fish, and their thing isn't gonna work out. Yeah, more importantly, I know that they haven't called me to come testify on this. I mean, I'd be comfortable in my opinion, but I feel bad for all the people around here. You know, after 100 years or so, everybody's got everything. They think it's all settled down, and the state comes in and stirs it up. And yeah, you know, legally the state was obligated to do what they did, but hopefully you would think ethically and morally they'd find ways to solve the problem to everybody's benefit. And maybe they will.
Did you say when that channel was cut that it was an action authorized by the county? Was the channel cut authorized by the county, or was it just done by John Doe landowner and the county just never said anything one way or the other?
I think it was done, there was an agricultural concern that owned a lot of the agricultural land, owned almost all of the water rights in this area, called Miller and Lux. I mean, if you look them up, you'll find a lot of stuff on them. I think they did that for navigational benefit.
Without county approval?
They were more powerful than the county. They were more powerful in the state in that area at the time.
So essentially with state approval?
No, was not with state approval.
So
Miller
it was
and
done by a
Lux,
private party
private
without any
company,
form
Miller
of
and
public...
Lux
Yeah,
were
done by a private party without any form of public approval?
Right.
Okay, what my point was going to be, if it was approved by the county, an argument could be made that the county is an arm of the state, and the state therefore tacitly approved that change, in which case it might not be treated as a avulsion. But if the county did not authorize it or approve it, then that would be a difficult argument to make. The landowners are probably screwed.
There were no records of the county approving anything there. And, you know, that's a good point. That would be an argument that could be made. I don't know if that would be successful, because the authority for that type of approval rests with a higher level of state. So it's like, you know, the guy at the counter can't approve your subdivision when the county supervisors are the one that need to sign off on it.
Mr. Evan?
Question?
So you found records of where the river was supposed to be? Is that how you determine that they're in those people's backyards? And if there was records of that,
Yeah, fortunately.
how did they claim that land that wasn't theirs?
Well,
mean, if you're the-
fortunately, Miller and Lux had their own engineering and surveying department, and they kept excellent records, and those records have not gotten destroyed over the years. Somehow, you know, copies of them got to the county, copies of them got to the local irrigation district, and the irrigation district had a complete set, and we were able to get them. And so there was a set of mapping that had some of this. There was also something called the Debris Commission back in the early 1900s that they were tasked, they were the U.S. Engineering Department, predecessor of the Army Corps of Engineers, was tasked with doing essentially a topo survey of all the navigable rivers in California to look for debris, obstacles to navigation. And this river was one of, a part of that effort back then. So we've got excellent mapping from that time too. And we had two sheets on this one. One was from 1911, I think, that showed here, and another one was updated in 1914 or 1915, where they drew this in and kind of halfway erased this here. So there you go. Why Fresno, and I don't know, it wasn't part of our tasking to find out, who claimed this and how they claimed this land over here on the Fresno side and how it started taxing there. So how that claim happened, I don't know. I just know that they looked at the physical division and The description was along the middle, or the middle of the San Joaquin River for both counties. And for whatever reason, the counties just accepted that after it was done. But again, the counties didn't really have the authority to do that. And so we came in and caused a whole lot of trouble there. Where are we? Okay, along non-navigable waters. If there's been some kind of a boundary line agreement between the non-navigable or the upland owners along a non-navigable waterway, this stream keeps shifting this way and it keeps shifting that way, over the years, and they get tired of that, and so they just agree on a line somewhere. That could happen. Where accretions have accumulated along the shore of a meandered navigable lake, or the lake has been lawfully drained, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we mentioned that one before. So effective against state patents, certainly. Against federal patents, maybe, maybe not. I don't think it's been tested in federal court, but my opinion is it probably would not be effective against federal patents. Artificial influence. Some typical examples, jetties, groins. Everybody know what a groin is. Not what we all have, but a groin is typically kind of like a rock wall that would be built perpendicular to the coast out, I don't know, maybe a couple 100 feet or so. And usually you'll see them in a few of them down a shoreline. And what that's supposed to do is reduce the effects of littoral drift in eroding away a beach. So think of it kind of as a mini jetty made out of rocks or sometimes chunks of concrete or something like that just goes out perpendicular from the beach. Dams, weirs, dredging, intentional rechannelization, and canals that add or remove water from the waterway. That was something that in the Central Valley, on that San Joaquin project, we had to look at that because there was a lot of water coming out for agricultural irrigation purposes. And we had to look at what that effect was from the natural water flow as you went downstream and more canals were taking water off. Jared, got 5 minutes. That's why I had extra time coming in. To fix the boundary, artificial influence must be direct and proximate cause. We have a good case on that in California. I don't know if there's a parallel case here in Oregon, but I think that they would probably have to look at that the same way. Would that be right?
Yeah, the presumption is accretion unless you can prove it.
Okay, presumption is natural unless you can prove. Okay. Most jurisdictions, including Oregon, give little consideration as to whether change to a waterway is natural or artificial. Okay, artificial influence, which do fix boundaries in Oregon. A rechannel, direct fill of submerged or submersible lands, direct removal of upland materials resulting. So that's purposeful, man-made, or man action stuff. Sometimes where the upland owners suffered a loss due to another's actions. So somebody else does some rechannelization or does something to obstruct the regular flow, reroute it. Upland owner acted intentionally to increase their own uplands. Here we have some rechannelization for navigable purposes. And then this lighter line is the old natural line. So unless the state did some kind of boundary line adjustments, then the public trust still goes over those old channels, and that's where state ownership is. Here we have an Avulsive channel, I think it's somewhere on the Mackenzie River. There was pre-Avulsive, then there was a storm, and so there's the old channel. Public trust is still there. Across here, a new channel, you have the public navigational easement, but not the full public trust. This person who owned this whole thing down here still owns the bed of that in fee, still owns this what would be kind of an island now. There's seawall and fill. That would fix it at the old natural location if you could find it. Here's an example. We caught these people in the act. I don't have the whole series here. But we had historic photos that showed an old 1929, showed the beach going there, and then progressive years, this rock revetment being built out further and further and further, and those developing more and more and more. But there, oh yeah, here it is, 1929, 1946, you can see the first remnants of some rock wall there. 1973, there in construction, gotcha. 2007. What do you think happened with this? Do you think the state sued them and told them to tear that down? No, it's somebody rich and connected, but our government doesn't work that way. Here, like I was asking about before, we've got artificial accretions here because you got the littoral drift pushing along. The natural ordinary high water mark might go in a straight line there, but you can see some buildup there. And there's actually probably, you'd see it more if this jetty was coming straight out, but there's a little bit of cupping there or artificial erosion. References and resources. DSL has a lot of good stuff. The list of navigable waters has come up quite a bit earlier today. Some other state agencies that you might get good information from: ODOT, Water Resource, Parks Rec, State Archives. Although our state people here, somebody mentioned State Archives and they both started laughing, so I don't know what's behind that. Probably hard to navigate. Local government, county surveyor, public works, irrigation districts. Like I said, that one set of maps we got from that irrigation district because they essentially inherited them from that Miller and Lux company. Federal agencies, BLM, Bureau of Rec, Forest Service. I had asked Brian about this. Bonneville Power doesn't have really very much, but they might. I mean, I think they're worth checking. Corps of Engineers, if they may have stuff. That debris commission mapping that I talked about that was so valuable on that one project, that was Corps of Engineers had, as being the successor agency to the engineering department, they inherited all that. And if records, field books particularly, were beyond more than a few decades old, National Archives had that. So we had to go to National Archives, spend a lot of time there. Here's some of the federal publications that are helpful. The 2009 BLM manual has a lot of water boundary content. Most of Jim Simpson's river and lake boundaries is now in there. And it's a great resource. 73, not so much. Upland boundaries, though. Here's some private text. You'll recognize some of these. My favorite for the West Coast is by Bruce Flushman here. He covers California, Oregon, Washington very well. Some of the other western states to a lesser degree. If you're working in other parts of the country, Cole is probably your go-to reference. I like them both. I just prefer Flushman's a little bit more. River and Lake, like I said, that is a fantastic resource, most of which is now in the 2009 manual. You can find some stuff in the Brown books. The older editions, in my opinion, much better than the newer editions. Clark. Here's some stuff, something by Jerry Broadus from back in the early 90s. California Land Surveyors Association, back in the late 70s, put together a water boundaries workshop. Here's another old one that's just kind of rare Roy Minnick thing. And that's one I put together for California, which I keep meaning to do for other states. Maybe someday I will. And with that, we're into practice questions and probably out of time. So, any questions? Back. Hold on, Jared's coming back with the microphone.
With that example of right there on the board, one thing, if you didn't have any maps or any other evidence from the locals, wherever else, to go back on that, you could have someone dig trenches across or do cross sections on that. I'm sure that they could determine the old riverbed that way based upon the bottom of the stream or whatever else was going on there, looking at the evidence on that.
Looking at the physical evidence here?
Yes, if
we didn't have all that historic
Right,
mapping?
if you had, you could do cross-section. You could, might even find some old Indian evidence of mortars, pestles there, stuff like that along the old banks.
Possibly, but again, there was a lot of disturbance here. Somebody had come through here with earth-moving equipment at some point and kind of smoothed it out quite a bit to where you could just barely, if you knew it was there, you could barely tell that there was, a depression about where that old channel is. But we would have had a really hard time proving that if we didn't have that mapping evidence. It's been probably so hard that nothing would have clued us in the field to say, oh, here's where the channel used to go, because they had smoothed it out that much. And the new channel had been there for about 100 years. So the mapping was invaluable, but it was also very conclusive. Anything else? All right, well, thank you very much.